we have three speakers today. Robert Farnan from the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development from Chiang Mai University, who will talk about practices of indigenous resurgence related to the formation of the Salween Peace Park in Myanmar. I will be the second speaker. My name is Sarah Benabou. I work for the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, and I am currently based at the French Institute of Pondicherry. So I will talk about the politics of social inclusion and its shortcomings in relation to what has been labeled the first community-based Red Plus project in Asia, which is located in the northeastern hills of India, so not very far from Myanmar. And last but not least, we have with us Nitin Rai, who is a senior fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment of Bangalore. And he will talk about the latest developments in the very iconic tiger conservation in India. So since we are only three speakers, I'm happy to say that we won't have to rush too much into the presentations. So we will have about 20 minutes each for our talk. And I will leave a couple of minutes if you need the speaker to clarify some points. And hopefully, if we manage to respect this timetable, we'll have a 10 minutes discussion at the end of this panel. So please, Rob.
Okay, afternoon everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for all your hard work organizing the panel. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the intersection of sustainable hydropower, environmental governance, and ecological knowledge production in the context of the Salween Peace Park in Nutra District, Karen State, Myanmar. I'll try to do this from a perspective that conceives of environmental governance as a hybrid process that's intimately tied to practices of indigeneity. So, as you can see, the talk will proceed as follows. I'll give a brief theoretical background of relationality, power, and what has been termed by some the ontological term. I'll look at the context of the Salween Peace Park and the connection between ecological knowledge and the discourse of indigeneity. I'll discuss why this has resonance among the caring struggle for self-determination, before touching briefly on critical indigenous scholarship and more deeply into relational ontologies. Then I'll look more substantively into care and ecological practices themselves. How practices are being formalized in relation to the SPP. Okay, so I'm contributing here to a larger discussion that aims to rethink the status ontologies and spatial temporal imaginaries that underlie the development of so-called structure in mainland Southeast Asia. The paper attempts to go beyond orthodox international financial institutions, such as the International Financial Corporation, as well as the managerial and indeed technocratic resolutions that stem from such an imaginary. Instead, the paper shows how hybrid practices of codification and/or formalization of care and ecological knowledge are constitutive of both environmental governance and the discourse of indigeneity. These knowledge practices provide, I argue, an alternative development pathway for understanding conservation of the commons to the one that is currently being pursued in the region. Okay, so generally speaking, orthodox analysis of the environmental commons in Southeast Asia or otherwise tends to be beholden to status ontologies whose attendant spatial temporal limits are articulated in and through property regimes and resource rights-based approaches to governance. In contrast, this paper argues that relational ontologies provide a more useful vantage point from which to think about power relations, ecological knowledge production, and the processual ways and understood. Okay, so moving on to the substantive portion of the talk, which is on understanding the connection between the creation of and contestation over the Salween Peace Park, ecological knowledge, and global discourse, specifically indigeneity and how indigeneity informs environmental governance and conservation. So the central research question of my paper is environmental governance of the commons entails the increasing influence of so-called global discourses. So to what extent are global discourses, such as indigeneity, informing environmental governance, particularly in the context of the SPP? Okay, so in order to go about this, we need to understand the extent to which indigenous discourse informs environmental governance. And to do that, we need to look at how people are actually operationalizing such knowledge through their engagement with the discourse of indigeneity. What my early research has found is that ecological knowledge practices are central to such practices, particularly the extent to which they appeal to indigeneity. So this connection between indigenous discourse and Karen ecological knowledge is central and fundamental to the struggle. Okay, so as you may be familiar, the contestation around the Salween Peace Park is based largely around the dispossession of villagers, which is happening due to a combination of factors. There's encroachment for the development of large-scale infrastructure projects, such as hydropower, mining, deforestation. There are also concerns about dispossession under the guise of conservation, sometimes championed by transnational NGOs such as WWF, in their efforts to protect endangered species such as the Bengal tiger in Uttar District. In conventional statist approaches to conservation, the state retains the ultimate authority and control over these areas, designated as conservation projects, leaving locals vulnerable to becoming what is called by some conservation refugees. Along with this, the concern is the destruction of lands with which the Karen villagers have a close, and this is key, spiritual connection. These problems are shared with many indigenous groups across the world, which is partly what makes the global indigenous discourse so appealing for the Karen in the context of the SPP, insofar that it provides a framework, a kind of cognitive map of solidarity for the struggle. Essentially, it's about what the global indigenous discourse is and how it can be used as a useful political tool. There are benefits to voicing a struggle in indigenous terms. The UN DRIP from 2007 supports the right of indigenous people held in the collective. For example, it enshrines communal land rights as opposed to individualistic rights, such as to property. This is very important for indigenous groups, and as we'll see, the Karen are no exception. The indigenous discourse, as expressed through a UN DRIP, emphasizes greater indigenous voices in environmental decision-making and also champions traditional knowledge practices, widely understood here as an umbrella term for traditional ecological knowledge. Again, this is deeply relevant for the Karen. This quote from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature highlights how ecological knowledge is treated in the global indigenous discourse. Okay, so I won't go into too much detail about the various legal instruments and norms that constitute the global indigenous discourse, but it's useful to look at a few key clauses within UN DRIP to help understand why it's so appealing for the Karen and how it relates to their ecological knowledge practices. Perhaps most importantly, it incorporates the emerging international principle of the indigenous right to free, prior, and informed consent for vetoing exploitative or damaging infrastructural development projects. It gives indigenous peoples the right to protection of the environment within their territories and places, this is quite key, the state as a secondary rather than controlling partner. And Clause 32 seeks to mitigate social, cultural, and spiritual impact on indigenous lands, instead of solely environmental impacts. So we'll see the significance of that move in a second. Another important aspect of the global indigenous discourse is the idea of the indigenous and community-conserved territories and areas, or the ICCAS. These are protected areas incorporated in the registry hosted by the UN Environment Programme and the IUCN. These designations have opened opportunities for indigenous people to retain and protect their territories from dispossession. Indigenous Canadian scholars Big Canoe and Richmond call them a tool of environmental repossession, or what I would like to argue, a tool for indigenous resurgence. You can see here the three characteristics ascribed to the ICCAs. One, a strong relationship must exist between the indigenous community and the territory. Two, that the indigenous community needs already to be engaged in some form of decision-making and show the capacity to govern itself sustainably. And lastly, that the indigenous community needs to enable conservation of habitat, species, and so on, even if this conservation is actually happening as a consequence of the safeguarding of cultural and spiritual values, for example, which we'll see with the case of the Karen. Okay, so KSAN is an organizational member of the ICA consortium and has the SPP, has added the SPP to the ICCA registry. Part of the objective in establishing the Peace Park has been to enable transnational collaboration and solidarity and to garner external support through its indigenous activist networks, a kind of hybrid governance, if you like. The adoption of the indigenous discourse, which has only really started to occur in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, including the ICCA, is seen as helping secure care and demands for communal land rights and an end to encroachment of their traditional territories. The literature describes the Peace Park as a project to promote peace building and preserve biodiversity, as well as ecological knowledge and environmental governance practices. We should note that some in the KNU reject the indigenous label on the basis that it further marginalizes them, but the majority support this practice of categorization. And indeed, the KNU's land and forest policies directly reference UNDRIP. They emphasize the social and cultural, spiritual, economic, environmental, and political value of the land for indigenous communities, which obviously differs quite substantially from the Burmese state's approach. Okay, so before I move on to look at current ecological knowledge practices, it's worth briefly pausing here to discuss some theoretical aspects. It's important to understand the ontology that shapes people's relationship with their environment in Neutral District. The Western ontological view of animism defines it crudely as a belief in spirits or sacred forces. But this is problematic because firstly, it fails to take animist ontology seriously. Harvey sums this up with the phrase, "we know while they believe." Secondly, it ignores the significance of relationality in animist ontology. As Tim Ingold has pointed out, an entity is only animate in the context of relations that make it so. Animist ontologies are incongruent with natural resource management and conservation schemes based on these status ontologies. Indigenous knowledge is treated as merely another form of data to be incorporated into existing scientific knowledge and governance regimes. As Andrew Paul has suggested, this necessitates a radical ontological shift, for example. We have to think differently about even the terminology of dispossession itself, because it implies land as property rather than as a social relation. This relates to the ontological turn in the politics of recognition. These theoretical moves highlight the issue of essentializing indigenous identities, such as expecting indigenous people to perform a particular indigeneity that the state ascribes as somehow authentic, and the need to focus on situated knowledges. We can also critique the indigenous discourse of the reification of indigenous knowledge, but I don't have the time to go into that right now. Another theoretical element is to highlight is that Karen indigenous ontology, as with the majority of others, is relational. This means that the category of person, and I think this was touched on in some of our early discussions this morning, that the category of person as a being with whom one can enter into a relationship extends beyond humans. It is an overarching category, i.e. animal person, wind person, and so on. Finally, we have to note that an ethic of reciprocity and mutual obligation to non-human social others guides the caring relationship with their land and natural resources. Again, just like with many other indigenous groups worldwide. Okay, so turning now to caring ecological knowledge practices themselves. Caring villagers practice multidimensional subsistence livelihoods in the communal landscape. They have terraced rice paddies like in these pictures, but they also grow produce such as chili peppers. They hunt, fish, and forage. For the Karen, the Ka is the unit of Karen territory. It means literally country, and the same word is used for nation states such as Burma. There's no formalized system of environmental governance. Instead, this is a complex animist cosmology and set of resource management practices. It's hard to overstate the extent to which spiritual relations form the foundation for ecological knowledge and environmental governance for the Karen and many other indigenous groups. It centers in part on the relationship between humans and what are called the Kasa spirits. Kasa means lord or owner. They are the guardian spirits of nature, and villagers maintain reciprocal relations with them. They must perform ceremonies and rituals so that they can maintain social and moral order. In Karen ontology, if there is something that disrupts this ecological human-spirit equilibrium, it is necessary to bring taku, which means coolness, and coolness is also seen here as kind of a prerequisite for peace itself. There is also an interesting link between Karen ecological knowledge related to taboos and the act of conservation. There are myriad taboos, so I'm not going to go and list them all, but I'll talk about a few key ones. The Peace Park itself is located in one of the most biodiverse regions in the world, home to 17 mammal species that are endangered, vulnerable, or indeed near threatened to extinction. Spiritual taboos that are part of the Karen animist ontology have historically functioned to protect many of these species from being hunted to extinction. For example, villagers won't touch tigers or bullock gibbons, the latter on the basis that due to their characteristic similarities with humans, that they may in fact be inhabited by humans. Aside from wildlife, there are also many forest areas that are traditionally conserved because they are the dwellings of the Tanuka spirits. Destroying these areas will unmoor the spirits and bring devastation upon the human community. This is hugely significant in terms of the ecology because it helps maintain biodiversity in forest habitats. The Karen also create protected forest corridors to enable the Tanuka spirits to travel. This means saving certain parts of the landscape, such as a mountain bridge, from clearance or other forms of human interference. Again, this has an unintended but crucial ecological benefit. There's another category of protected forests called spirit groves, which are lands linked to human birth and death. For example, the Babe Palaw Grove is where the life of a newborn baby becomes attached to the life of a tree by wrapping the umbilical cord around the tree. The Low is perhaps the most sacred place in the Karen Ka. It is the final resting place of the spirits of the deceased. All the villagers must return in death to their ancestral Low. So, of course, clearing this land is also a strict taboo with terrible spiritual and material consequences if violated. Those are indeed assigned community forest status in the KNU's recent forest policy. So any unusual landscape features in a Ka, the ecological benefits of these knowledge practices are quite clear. They protect watersheds, create networks of untouched habitat for flora and fauna, and help maintain biodiversity. The Karen are well aware of these benefits. For them, this just demonstrates a gentle nature of the spirits in helping to govern and conserve the environment. Okay, so ceremonies and rituals. These are performed annually to placate the spirits and to ask for help in return, such as abundant rainfall. They are very important in environmental governance and viewed as obligations humans have in their contract with the spiritual owners of the land. An example of a ceremonial obligation is the sacrificing of a chicken, which you can see here in the image. Individuals also practice their own rituals connected with the agricultural cycle and their own particular needs. The point is that they are not the owners of the land, the spirits are. They are merely tenants, and these ceremonial and ritual obligations are their payment. Otherwise, the relationship is broken, and the result may be calamitous. This is the Tipu Kakasa. He is the most important person in a Ka, but the job is mostly to conduct ceremonies rather than to police villagers' actions. Elders and youth organizations are also important in this context, but again, Their roles are to act in various ways as conduits to the spirits who are deemed to be the ultimate authority. This reflects the lack of centralized authority structures and formalized laws within the Ka. It's an informal, diffuse governance structure which is based on this ecological knowledge system expressed in ceremonies, rituals, and taboos for agential non-human forces. So the social relations we've emphasized constitute the Karen indigenous legal order and also fit neatly into a broader global indigenous discourse. Humans cannot unilaterally change or annul this legal order because no humans controls the villagers' use of the land under this rendering. It differs from statutory legal systems proffered by the state, property relations, and structures of control that are grounded in such an ontology. The legal order here is based on an internal and external duality. The internalized dimension is based on each individual's self-policing, practicing accountability to all other social relations. This is necessary because human authorities do not directly impose sanctions for such taboo violations. The spirits indeed govern human behavior in this context. The external dimension is based on the performance of ceremonies and rituals led by key members of the community in which all villagers are expected to participate. Okay, so CSOs, in particular KSAN, the group that I've focused my research on, have identified the need to codify this ecological knowledge and environmental governance practices. KSAN has commissioned research projects to investigate care and customary land governance and identify ways to protect land from encroachment. They are engaging in this indigenous struggle or resurgent in two ways. First is what we describe as a project of resuscitation of the Karen Ka and associated knowledge and governance practices. This is an internal process with the communities themselves. The goal here is to strengthen social spiritual relations and ensure a kind of buy-in from all the villagers. The second is the effort to build alliances with other indigenous groups, organizations, and consortiums elsewhere in the region, and bring the global discourse of indigeneity to bear on the SPP, constructing it as an indigenous political initiative. Okay, so to briefly summarize, the role of indigeneity is central in the context of the Salmon Peace Park, and particularly its incorporation of traditional Karen ecological knowledge. Discussion of Karen ecological knowledge, therefore, must be done in conjunction with the concept of indigeneity, seen here as a political tool. Ecological knowledge of animist Karen practices in the SPP is centrally, or revolves centrally around human-spirit relations, and necessitates, if we are to take it seriously, a more open ontological approach, which avoids temptations to compartmentalize such practices as mere belief as opposed to knowledge. Karen animists emphasize, above all, that the ecological benefits of these livelihood practices may have unintended consequences for conservation. Thank you for your time.
So my presentation will be a bridge between what Bob just said about indigeneity as a political tool and what Nitin will talk about later regarding state conservation. Just okay, so now we as many of you may know, the modern ecological history of India is largely dominated by the fact that the vast majority of forests have been, since colonial times, under the direct control of state forest departments, that customary rights have remained largely ignored, and that the current spirit of decentralized governance is still pervaded by state dominance over natural resources, what we call in India the eminent domain principle. So issues like insecurity of land tenure and access rights continue to make newspaper headlines, even after the enactment of the Forest Rights Act in 2006, whose objective was precisely to recognize and vest rights of forest communities. Just to give you an example, a few months ago, the Supreme Court ordered the eviction of close to 1 million people whose claims under the Forest Rights Act were rejected. So this order has now been stayed, but the situation for all these people remains very unclear. So this was just to give you a very rough picture of the general context in which conservation unfolds in India, and I'm sure Nitin will provide you a further illustration of this. So it's no exaggeration to say that for local inhabitants, conservation is more often than not understood as a coercive state endeavor, blind to local demands and threatening land tenure security. But that said, and I will talk about this, complexities of empirical context matter, and we should be wary of not assuming a singular hegemonic state-led project. There are indeed few exceptions to these general trends, and the position of many upland areas of northeast India is one of them. So this northeastern region is unique in many aspects. As you can see, it is connected to the rest of the country only by a narrow stretch of land, which isolated the region for decades culturally, politically, and logistically. The Northeast is nowadays increasingly influenced by the massive nation of which it represents a very small outlying part, but it remains remarkably diverse in terms of language, religion, livelihoods, or ethnicity. And as far as forests are concerned, the situation is also very different from mainland India. I quote here the anthropologist Ben Carlson. The All India lexicon of environmental protests does not apply in the Northeast. To begin with, the main villain, the Forest Department, is not the all-powerful institution that it appears to be elsewhere in India. It is people and not the Forest Department that officially own and manage most of the forest lands in the northeastern hills. So you will find the reason of this kind of unique setup in the history of the upland tribal areas of this region, whose remoteness hindered most colonial expansion and left the population with a fair degree of self-government. And after independence, many districts of the northeast, such as the East Khasi Hills district where I did my fieldwork, were included in the 6th schedule of the Constitution. So this was done to enable scheduled tribes to live according to their own ways, and obviously to contain secessionist claims. And this spatial status allowed these areas to keep a significant autonomy under the jurisdiction of autonomous district councils and traditional indigenous institutions. So as a result, in contrast to India as a whole, the vast majority of forests in the northeastern hills are still owned by communities, clans, and families. So in the state of Meghalaya today, where the East Khasi Hills district is located, less than 10% of the forests in this state are under the authority of the State Forest Department. So my research aims to examine how a green economy experiment entitled the Khasi Hills Community Red Plus Project unfolds in the particular institutional context of these frontier areas, which is indeed very different from the situation of the rest of the country. So given the history of conservation policies in India, there are good reason to be skeptical that forest-dependent people will ever be able to benefit from reforestation activities such as RED. But to walk down the path traced by Carlson, what does the situation look like when the picture is slightly complicated? Namely, when the state is not fully in control and forests are owned and managed by people. Can we assume that this difference in property arrangements, benefits the management of the forest and the community to whom it belongs. So I will use one of the main disarming takeaway of my fieldworks as a point of entry onto this otherwise very complex question. After a decade of work on the social cost of protected areas of mainland India, I was suddenly facing in the Khasi Hills what looked like a consensus. I had to acknowledge the fact that the Red Plus project was almost unanimously approved by the villagers, in contrast with what I expected, and also with the concerns of outside activists who were worried that people might lose control over their lands. Such happy situations, so to say, certainly provokes questions for our community of critical scholars, which has produced an impressive literature on neoliberal instruments such as RED. So what particularly matters, as I will argue here, is to understand the processes that have contributed to shape this consensus, but also to locate these processes within the existing power relations in the area, to finally discuss whether this consensus necessarily translates into the improvement of livelihoods of poor farmers. So my first point is that the local consensus behind this project is largely shaped by the way it has been framed, namely by building on cultural difference. So the Khasi Hills Red Plus project is a program to protect and restore 27,000 hectares of forests and improve incomes for 4,000 families living under $2 per day. And as such, it is not really different from any other reforestation programs run throughout the world. Its particularity, however, is that it builds itself as, I quote, one of the first Red Plus initiatives in Asia to be developed and managed by indigenous governments on communal lands. So social inclusion is a key feature of this project. The idea of social inclusion is to actively enable usually neglected actors to participate in and benefit from the policies and measures put in place, so here under the Red Plus tag. And for the promoters of this particular project, this objective is facilitated by the fact that they are dealing here with sovereign communities who own and control their forests. And not just that, but also communities known for their age-old ecological practices. So, unlike other forestry projects in India that have long been criticized for being too centralized into the hand of the powerful forest department, this project taps into the particularity of Meghalaya as a sixth scheduled state, and more generally in the idea that the Khasi Hills is a propitious site for a Red Plus project because of the long-established traditions of community forest management that the project is just there to strengthen. So Community Forestry International, which is the American NGO that started the whole project, has extensively used this trope as a way to publicize the project and attract buyers, as you will see in the screenshot of a promotional movie. I'm not playing the movie because for some reason it never worked, so I'm going to read it out. So the movie says, tradition, rituals, and respect of India's northeastern state of Meghalaya, the land of the clouds. Sacred groves scattered throughout their land are a testimony to their traditions of forest conservation. In the last few decades, however, damaging extractive industrial practices and global climate change are taking their toll. In June 2011, the Khasi formed a federation of 10 indigenous kingdoms to unite their efforts to restore and protect their forests. Okay, so what is clear from this movie is how much the project rests on the idea that forest conservation is an activity for which Khasi people are already culturally predisposed, with sacred groves as the ultimate proof of it. The matching piece of this picture is the bias towards putative native communitarianism, whose ideological roots can be traced to the colonial period. The idea that Khasi can better be addressed as a collective subject through a federation clearly obscures the fact that in Meghalaya today, individualistic behaviors are widespread, and common land under an intense wave of privatization and degradation. And when the movie talks about environmental degradation, it is attributed to generic, damaging industrial practices, commitment to ancestral land, conservation, and so on. So this is a kind of ethnic spatial fix, to use a key concept developed by Tanya Morelli. And this is a strategy which is very well received locally, because it is commonly used in indigenous politics as a bastion against dispossession by large-scale state or corporate projects, such as dams, mines, or plantations, as Bob has just talked about. But it carries its own dilemmas when failures to abide by these standards of radical alterity as virtue become manifest, as we will see later. So what I want to examine now is how in practice, that is through the diffusion of what kind of incentives or institutions, such as this federation, the Red Plus project reinforces a social reality it suggests already exists, how the assumed communitarian or ecological nature of the Cassis is built up, reinforced, and my last point will be on the limits of this process. So what was indeed very fascinating to witness during my fieldwork was the environmentality dimension of the project, which is, in my opinion, one of its most visible accomplishments to date. By environmentality, I mean what seems to be a profound conviction among many of the villagers who, for some of them, were involved in mining or logging, in the necessity to protect their forests. This form of internalization of environmental concerns, I want to argue here, is the result of incentives set up by the project and designed to build up a community that would ideally, collectively and freely decide in its own interest to adopt good practices and drop bad habits. So we are clearly in the realm of neoliberal governance with more or less subtle means to achieve this goal. The emphasis put on choice is absolutely crucial here, and it is achieved in part through the creation of an institutional apparatus which is closely involving two very important levels of Cassis communal governance, namely at the village level and the HIMA level. HIMA is the name for the native state or kingdom, so one district will have several HIMAs. So the village level and the HIMA level, they rely on consensus-based decision-making through the very important institution of the Dorba, the council. These councils in this particular project have to give their consent every step of the way, and their heads have formed an apex body called the Federation or Sinjuk that oversees the whole project. So needless to say, the fact that the project is backed by traditional institutions and not by the state makes a big difference in the eyes of the villagers. It seems that in this case, fencing off land for conservation through what they call social fencing does not include the coercive element I found when I was working on protected areas in Uttarakhand. Secondly, the mobilization of the area also relies on a massive campaign of environmental education orchestrated by the Secretariat of the Federation. So the Secretariat is run by a middle-aged Cassis man that you, if you are attentive, is almost in every picture. So this guy does not count his time when it comes to preach the good words among the people of his community, and the fact that he's also a preacher and belongs to the priest clan of the Sika. He's helped in his task by a group of young people from the area, who I came to nickname the foot soldiers for the energy they deploy to make the project work on the ground. Okay, that was working. And finally, the project obviously does not rely only on good words, but also on hard cash. Financial incentives are there to promote and reward efficiency and entrepreneurship through performance-based payments or individual grants and the establishment of self-help groups that act as microfinance institutions within the villages. These soft incentives are coupled to more disciplinary procedures of audit and accountability requested by the organization who sell the CASI project abroad who sell the carbon credit. So this put considerable pressure on the Secretariat, with the effect that a good deal of their time is used to check on the field whether the project delivers its promises. So, as a typical, cynical, blasé social scientist, I came rather disappointed from my last fieldwork trip, carrying mostly good news. People are happy, what I'm going to say to you. I will, however, finish with some bits and pieces that show that even though the constitution of environmental subject is undeniable, the project rests on several disjunctions between the inclusive model that is promoted and its actual implementation that renders this project very fragile in the long run. So the first tension I see is between the idea of the sovereign community and the emergence of the figure of the green entrepreneur. As I suggested earlier, the project is a one-man show. Without the local head of the project, there is little doubt that the whole organization, even though backed by traditional institutions, will collapse. And obviously, the rise of this local figure is a source of suspicion within the community and creates dissent. The other tension is between the so-called innovative dimension of this new project and the actual nature of eco-development activities. Because as far as the improvement of livelihoods is concerned, the project does not differ at all from state-led eco-development schemes run throughout India that so far have not proved to be particularly life-changing, such as the distribution of LPG gas stoves or rice cookers, the creation of farmers' clubs, self-help groups, and so on. And finally, the tension between the politics of inclusion and the structural social inequalities. Because it is very easy to observe that equity issues persist regarding, for instance, the inclusion of women who traditionally are not part of the door bar of the council, or regarding who benefit the most from the project, because of course there is not big money to be made here, but the villagers who benefit the most, notably through the distribution of individual grants, are either those who are the most dedicated and involved, which means people who have access to the knowledge required and are usually belonging to families of headmen or relatives of the staff of the federation, or either people who own lots of land and are able to give their forest to the project, such as the ladies on the right picture. And the list could be continued. So as a conclusion, to come back to my initial question, when it is the community which decides to fence off the forest, is the population any better off than when it is imposed on it? What is clear from this case study is that, on the one hand, we should not dismiss the fact that the Red Cross project acts as cement for the community, which is indeed empowered and channeled to rebuild itself around the objective of fighting deforestation. And this is very important. But on the other hand, the project is not a game changer in the sense that the virtuous but selective specificities of people and place hold little ground when faced with raw realities, such as the difficulty to overcome the free rider problem when most of the work is in reality carried on the shoulders of one person, with the attendant benefits for him in terms of recognition and symbolic capital. Realities such as the overall lack of imagination with the use of one-size-fits-all solutions, and realities such as the local structural inequalities that tend to favor the already privileged or traditional powerful segments of the community. In other words, sovereign communities and land tenure security are very necessary but not sufficient to act as a barrier against inequalities in the control of forest resources.